Recorded.
So today is Thursday, the 4th of May, 2023, and this Tech Hour is celebrating 30 years of the World Wide Web software being open source. So on the 30th of April, 1993, the CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, put into the public domain the software that Tim Berners-Lee and others had written as part of their work in CERN. Tim Berners-Lee was something like document management specialist, something like that. And documents often meant printed documents or documents that were being prepared electronically to be printed. And because CERN has a lot of visitors coming from abroad and collaborators from abroad, it's a sort of something of a hub for collaboration and communication. And the network that existed was being used for the retrieval of documents and also for finding out information about documents, what documents were available. So I remember in 1995, I organized or co-organized a tech user group meeting in the UK together with the British Computer Society Electronic Publishing Group on tech and HTML and PDF. And it was HTML because XML didn't exist at that time, and PDF was a new thing from Adobe, which was PostScript cleaned up. And that was my first real contact, if you like, with the web and the internet. Somebody had kindly given me an account at the Cambridge Math Department, so I was able to go in and read news and send email and that sort of thing. And it's very interesting. I prepared a document pack. This is a sort of personal story of what things were like in 1993 or 1995. I prepared a document pack for all the people that attended the meeting, a resource pack. And it was well received. And I downloaded lots of web pages that were of interest and printed them off and put them into a folder so that every day they got a folder of stuff to take with them. And that was the sort of thing you expected then when you went to a conference. You'd expect to get handouts of not just pieces of paper you'd need during the conference, but things to take home with you, a resource pack. So there was an Oasis guide to software, and I can't remember what else. And I've still got a copy of that pack somewhere, I think, because I don't keep things, even though paper's bulky. And what I didn't realize at the time, but I realized very, very recently, it's surprisingly how long it's taken, is that HTML was all concerned about unrendered documents that were rendered however. So web browsers rendered things in whichever way they wanted. And I remember that Peter Flynn, one of the speakers, who's still a member of the tech community, said that with web pages, CSS can poison your document and make it say things that appear to be different because you just use a different font that essentially encodes the letters differently. And it can appear to say one thing, but it really says something else. Whereas PDF didn't have that problem. And at that time, already in 1993, if I thought about it, 1995, if I thought about it, I would have seen those two big streams of XML type markup and precise rendering for a photo typesetter. So that tension was already existing in 1995. And the whole thing then was unbelievably primitive and clunky, particularly compared to tech, which had really high quality output. Even if you had a 300 dpi laser printer, it was fantastically high quality output. And you could send it to a service bureau to get full resolution. So it was, in terms of sophistication, tech was really sophisticated and web browsers weren't. But web browsers have this dynamism that you could click a button and within 5 seconds, you get a response from another country. That is absolutely extraordinary. When without a network, you send a letter and within a week, you'll get a response from another country. So what CERN did 30 years ago was they said, this software is now public domain. So if you want to, you can write commercial software based upon what we've done and sell your own web browser. And I'm sure that lots of people read the CERN software and said, oh, this is how it's done. We'll use this open source public domain software as the starting point for whatever we're doing. And out of that was Netscape, which was excluded from Windows, Microsoft's product, and was a central part in the antitrust lawsuit against Windows. And I remember speaking with Linux people and understanding what was going on. And the whole point about the case was that the web browser was a platform that threatened the Windows ecosystem and platform. It was a different platform on which to write applications. And the antitrust battle with Microsoft, if you like, was a bit of a draw. And the adoption of Linux by Microsoft as part of their Azure cloud and Windows subsystem for Linux is a sort of moral victory for Linux, if you like. But what has happened, and Google has had a great deal to do with that, is that the web browser is now a platform. And I'm speaking to you now through a web page. And that was unbelievable in 1995. But I could sit at my desk and speak with people in other continents, other countries in real time through an application that didn't exist on my computer and would disappear when I turned my computer off. And that's the web browser and HTML, and in particular HTML5. So it's been an enormously long journey. Here's an interesting bit of history, which is communication of information without moving things. Books were shipped from place to place. Venice, it's no accident that Venice was both a center of trade, a trade center, and also a center of printing. That's where Aldus Manutius set up. And books were shipped from one place to another to communicate information on boats with sails. And Cambridge University Press I think in the 19th century, they set up new buildings for the Cambridge University Press, and they deliberately put the press buildings next to the river so that heavy things could go in and out of the press along the river rather than through the inadequate roads and carting system. So moving information by moving physical objects was the way in which things were done for a long time, except in special cases. And I'm going to tell you about two special cases. One is related to the Spanish Armada, which I was taught about in school in a rather English point of view. And the point I want to make here is that as part of the preparations for the threatened invasion of England by Spain, a series of beacons were built on hills in England and Wales. And a beacon could be lit at one place, and that would be a signal for the next beacon to light and the next beacon to light, and the next beacon to light. And that would spread the news of the Spanish invasion across the whole country. So that's communication of information, one bit of information without moving anything. Another way of doing that is, of course, talking. Voice is a wave motion. Semaphore, moving flags, is a way of communicating information without moving anything. So again, back to Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar, which involves the French this time. A coding system of flags was put up and a message came out: England expects every man to do their duty. The French had a system of communication across the country that worked in the daylight that used reflections on mirrors. It's called heliotrope. So I think it's called heliotrope. So you have a mirror, and if the mirror is reflecting the light to you and then I wiggle it, you can see the wiggle from 5 miles away or 10 miles away. And that was an important part of the toolkit of the French in terms of their fixed army. And I think it was used in India and other places. And then, of course, came radio. And that's communicating information without moving objects. And if you like, the 20th century was in part the century of radio, and that has reached its present zenith through Wi-Fi. So my communication to you is not only going through the network, but there's no physical cable linking my computer to the router. It's a wireless network. Where was I? Yeah, so the whole 20th century, there's been a move away from the physical movement of objects in order to communicate information. And that, I think, is actually profound, very profound. And the World Wide Web applies that to documents, and they talk about web pages. So this is a sheet of paper. It's not a page because it's not part of a book. But if I pulled up a book and showed it, you see a page. And the web allows pages to be sent from one place to another without physically moving anything. In the 1930s, this was possible through telephone lines, and you'd send a sort of pulse modulated signal down the telephone line that allowed a photograph to be taken from the sports ground and sent from the sports ground to the printing press, that sort of thing. And it was a real specialist thing, and you'd read about it in encyclopedias as the wonders of modern technology, that you could take a photograph and develop it and send it to London, and it would be in the evening paper. That's what high technology was in the 30s and 40s. And the World Wide Web, I think, has captured that. And I think one of the really important things about the web being open source is that it allowed anybody to get in on it, including Netscape. And that gave established powers, or newly established powers, such as Microsoft, quite a run for their money. So I'll try and stop there. And I hope that there might be a question or a comment, or somebody else who's got something else they like to share.
You left out the telegraph.
I'm sorry?
You left out the telegraph.
Oh, yes, I did leave out the telegraph. Yeah. The railway lines were designed for the physical movement of objects, but they also provided a pathway for telegraphs. And also, a market for telegraphs, if you like. I know a nice story about telegraphs, and I don't remember which American state it was. It was during the Civil War. One of the American states had passed its constitution and wished to be admitted to the Union. And President Lincoln was very keen indeed that this state be admitted, because admission to the Union would give them votes in the presidential election. And Pony Express or something like that was supposed to be delivering the Constitution to Washington, Washington DC, so everything could be done. But it didn't seem to be arriving in time. And so at tremendous expense, it was something like $30,000 at that time, something like that, very expensive. It held the world record for a long time. The whole of the Constitution was sent from the state capital to the Washington DC by telegraph, relayed, so that the Constitution could be arrived at DC and the state could be admitted. And that was in 1860 something. And that's the telegraph communicating a document of great importance without physically moving a copy. Whereas on January the 6th in Washington, DC, there were ceremonial copies of state electoral college results that were at the ceremonial meeting of Senate to confirm the election of Joseph Biden. So there they ceremonially used paper documents, and there might have been all manner of trouble if those paper documents had been not removed from the chamber before the rioters arrived. That could have caused a lot of difficulty to proceedings. Shamsi, can I read your quote, Shamsi, or would you like to do it to speak to it?
Just posting a second one. Yeah, please do read them. I think they're very interesting.
Sorry?
Please go ahead and read them. I think they're very interesting.
Okay, so this is from Shamsi, who said that there are some quotes from the Accessibility Forum that are a bit relevant. So the first is from Avishnesh Singh, and he was one of the panel speakers. We are in revolutionary times. We have a great opportunity at hand for creating the universal standards for accessibility for research papers. So I'm going to pause for a moment. The openness of the World Wide Web software and the establishment of the World Wide Web Consortium and the community that is evolved around it, and a certain sort of spirit of, well, we know you have proprietary interests, but a rising tide lifts all boats, and we don't want you spitting in the soup. So it really would be very helpful if you conformed to the standards and aimed with the standards process we're going with. And if you didn't, then your highly qualified technical people might decide that they'd rather work somewhere else. So I'm perhaps saying things that are not true or not said, but there is some sort of spirit that is an enabler, together with the openness of tech and the openness of LaTeX, that's an enabler. So Avishnesh said, we are in revolutionary times. We have a great opportunity at hand for creating the universal standards for accessibility for research papers. So it's not, he says, it's not just a question of we can make some of these papers accessible, or all of them, but that we can actually establish a standard that all will use. And at some point I should mention CSS, because that's one of the great successes in web standards, I think. So the next thing from Shamsi is Julie Williamson. Julie Williamson. The main issue I found is that this fixation and attachment to print metaphors, print constraints, and really people are very attached to it. That's where a lot of the resistance come in from authors, particularly where there are a lot of technical, and particularly where a lot of technical challenges come as well, which has led me to a very clear view that I think PDF should be sunsetted. If I made such a statement, I would also say, and this is an echo of an event that's happening in my country on Saturday, something that's hasn't happened for 70 years. So I would say, in addition to saying that PDF should be sunsetted, I would also add, long live digital typography. Digital typography is extremely valuable, and it's part of the tradition on which the sunsetting of PDF should be built if it happens. A printed page in a technical manual, and I'm thinking of the almanac, the astronomical almanac of the Greenwich Observatory, which a friend of mine used to be responsible for the typesetting of, which is a really important document that's been in publication for a very, very long time. And every ship would have that almanac because it gave the astronomical information you needed to find out where you were from astronomical observations. Really important, really important. So that sort of technical communication of information, there's an enormous expertise in print. Nelson can probably echo this much more than I can. And we don't want to lose that. And the lack of sophistication in Markdown from that technical point of view is a serious problem. And then in the humanities, the dictionaries have a tremendous ability to communicate information visually and clearly that is not managed, I think, by web typography at present.
Yeah, I'd also like to remark that although many people are keen on the idea of electronic documents, they don't weigh very much, for example. It's easy to carry around an encyclopedia in your pocket telephone. But they do allow for massive instantaneous censorship. And this is, I think, a very serious issue that people are largely neglecting. You see on the shelves behind me large numbers of physical books. Well, if one of those were banned by our state legislature here, it would have no effect on me because I have my own personal copy and they're not going to be able to locate it and take it away. But with electronically downloaded things, they can very easily. This has already happened a number of years ago. Amazon withdrew from people's devices Kindle books that they had decided they really shouldn't be distributing. And we've seen in country after country national attempts at censoring access to the internet. So even though there's certainly a reasonable demand for having accessible documents in more than just print form, I think we must hold on to print very, very strongly because it's our guarantee against tyranny.
There's a wonderful project called LOCKSS, LOCKSS. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. And one of the things that print did is it allowed the preservation of documents. That was one of the important roles it provided. And lawyers, it meant that the law was no longer what the king said it was. It was what was published as the law. and it was possible, it was no longer necessary. The Doomsday Book was one book, and you had to consult the Doomsday Book to consult the Doomsday Book. There was no copies of it. And to introduce it in evidence, presumably somebody had to actually go there and copy it out to say this is a certified copy of the Doomsday Book. The preservation of digital information is really very, very important. And the question of censorship started with the printing press, and printing presses had to be licensed. So it's not a new problem, but I agree with you, it's a particularly important problem. And the preservation of content, the preservation of digital content is a really important thing. And I would say that Git is your friend in this. That if there's a book and I want to keep a safe copy of it, I should have its Git secure hash, and I should make sure that lots of people have copies of that book. And if you ever want to be sure that you've got a proper copy, you have a look at the secure hash, and that gives a pretty good standard of preservation. But so what I'm saying is not that I think your point is a really important one, and it's something in the print culture that's very important that we don't want to lose. I don't see it as an argument necessarily for keeping print, but it's something that should be kept. I don't know if you see that point of view, Nelson. Have I expressed it clear?
Oh, absolutely. The issue with electronic documents is that it's now possible, and has been done several times in multiple countries, to entirely cut off access to the internet and to mobile phones. And totalitarian governments are rather keen on doing this when things happen that they disapprove of. When every individual owns a copy of a book, it's rather much harder for them to take that access away. And we've seen with the rise of right-wing political views in my country that more and more state legislatures are looking at banning books of various types that they disapprove of, not only books, but movies and other things. And on my own campus, we're currently dealing with a push from higher ups to put spyware into computers that will largely be a huge big brother is watching you that we're very unhappy about, and I don't know yet whether we can resist it.
There's the other side of it, which is that it's easier to smuggle out information on a memory card, or SIM card. It's easier to smuggle that out than to smuggle out thousands of pages. So I think these are important matters, and my general view is the culture of the book is really important, and the paper is a carrier of that culture, and we should be careful about dispensing with paper, but we should not either rely on it or disparage alternatives. There's another quote from Shamsi, or rather relayed by Shamsi, which is from Patrick Smythe, again a panelist at the Accessibility Forum. It touches on democracy in the web. Patrick says, it's really important that we have blind people, people with disabilities, people from marginal communities learn serious technical skills. not just consumers, but are actively involved in the creation of the tools and the platforms and the formatting and the standards. So I don't see, I think that's right. Let me tell you something about web pages, which is really interesting. In the early days, you didn't need a manual to know how to create web pages. You just
Sorry?
visited a website.
Sorry, you didn't need a what?
I'm sorry, Philip?
I didn't understand it acoustically. You say you didn't need what?
In the early days of the web, you didn't need a manual or a book
Okay.
or a tutor to tell you how to write web pages. You just went to a web page you liked, hit the button that said control source, that showed you the source, and you could see the source in a reasonably comprehensible form that created the page. And so you could say, oh, that's how you do it, or that's how they did that. So if there's some effect that you particularly like, it's there. And by and large, in those days, certainly was unobscured and unobfuscated. Nowadays, things are rather different and so forth, but that general principle of the code is running on your computer, all the stuff that's running you downloaded, you can have a look at that stuff and figure out how it's done. And even if you don't understand how it works, you can try tweaking it and see what's happening. Now, one of the great technical standards in web development is cascading style sheets. Before cascading style sheets, you were applying explicit style elements to every bit and piece of the whole document. Whereas with cascading style sheets, you gave every document had a tag name that gave the semantic or structural nature of the thing, such as the table. And you also had a class that sort of said what variant of a paragraph it was. And that would give you a background or a color, change the font colors, change the font size. And you could style a whole document with a cascading style sheet. And there's a sort, it's called cascade because there's a sort of, where you look here, if it's not there, you look there and there and there. You could call it an escalating style sheet, but cascading sounds better. And you could use the same cascading style sheet across the whole website. And you could change the look and feel of the whole website by changing that cascading style sheet. And that takes you right into accessibility, because you could have different style sheets for different purposes. And that's one way of changing the size of the fonts, is to use a different style sheet or by having a high contrast. So that immediately provides an accessibility tool. And cascading style sheets was a good invention. It was technically well done, I think. And everybody adopted it because it cleaned up what was otherwise a horrible mess. So my recollection of the adoption of the cascading style sheets is everybody says, yes, and it happened. Now, Patrick is touching on democracy in the web. It's really important that we have blind people, people with disabilities, people from marginalized communities learn serious technical skills. I'm in the Python community, and there's a web framework called Django that's very good at what's called a LAMP stack, which is a sort of e-commerce, for example. Linux, Apache, Linux is the platform, Apache is the web server, MySQL is the database, and Python or Perl is the programming language. It's called LAMP. And Django is quite good for diversity in marginalized communities, as is Python, I think. And one of the most successful things they've adopted is Django Girls, and they bring people to Python conferences for Django Girls workshop and session, and carefully designed material, and tutors go through, and at the end of 2 days or whatever it is, they will have created their own dynamic website with the database backend and create, what is it? Create, read, update, and delete. That's your standard operations on a website that's got author supplied content. The user creates a page, they read the page, they update the page, and then the page gets deleted, possibly. So that sort of website, which is a forum or something, is bread and butter for many, many people, and it's an alternative to WordPress, and that's a real skill. So yeah, I agree with Patrick on that.
I think a key lesson of the comment is the importance of diversity. We observe this in biology, where diversity ensures preservation of at least some of the species. If we have monoculture like we have with Cavendish bananas or Irish potatoes in the 1830s, a single disease can wipe out the entire crop. And this is definitely a huge problem. So the more views we have, the better. And one of the great things about working at a university is you're surrounded by people from many different cultures and languages and countries. And that makes it a very rich and rewarding environment to work in. And unfortunately, most of our society doesn't enjoy that. They live in relatively small communities with limited exposure to others.
I wonder if I could encourage you, Nelson, before you have to leave, if you'd like to say something about your experience of the history of the web. Anything remarkable or notable?
Well, at Utah, we happen to have workstations that were able to run Mosaic and early releases of Netscape. And of course, Jim Clark, the author of Netscape, is a Utah graduate. So we have a long connection with the web. And it was clear, I think, from the beginning that Tim Berners-Lee had exactly the right idea, that sharing of information in a relatively simple format and doing so worldwide in a browser agnostic way. In other words, that the format that the document was created in could be interpreted by many different pieces of software that might read it in audio form, that might display it in a plain text screen, in browsers like Lynx and Netric and W3M and so on, or in a fancy browser like Brave or Internet Explorer, Mozilla, Firefox, and many others, is certainly proven its worth. And one of the things that it encourages people to do is to stop thinking as they're writing, what does this document look like? It's much more important for them to describe what it is they have. I have a table, I have a figure, I have a paragraph, I have a section, without worrying too much about the appearance, because there's no way you can control the appearance of a web page, because people view it on devices of many different sizes and fonts and colors and so on. And that's all, I think, quite healthy. It's been frustrating, I think, that proper support for mathematics in web browsers has taken such a long time. I mean, we essentially have 30 years of web browsers and perhaps only fewer than 5 years of good mathematics display. And it's still problematic because I see examples of using Unicode to represent mathematics, completely ignoring the fact that mathematics is two-dimensional. The relative positions of objects matter. And so something like a square root sign in mathematical typesetting has a horizontal bar that covers what it applies to. And yet I see documents in which there's a Unicode square root sign followed by A plus B plus C, and you have no idea what it applies to. And that's partly evidence of people's unfamiliarity with mathematics and its meaning in conventional display. So we're not there yet, is what it boils down to. We do need better ways of dealing with mathematics. And not only mathematics, if you take physics, where there, for example, in theoretical physics, Feynman diagrams communicate a great deal of information and have very particular forms. We don't have simple ways to create those quickly. Similarly, in chemistry, chemical structures these days are typically done by expensive commercial software like ChemDraw, but it isn't easy to create documents quickly. And because it's commercial, you don't have the freedom you might have if there were open source software for doing things. And I'm sure the field of medicine has got all kinds of issues with presentation of graphical views of tissues and bones and intestines and so on, where quick visualization could be really, really beneficial, but it isn't quick today.
You're muted, Jonathan.
Nelson, when you were talking about the early days in Mosaic, and I think you said Jim Fox at the University of Utah, when was that? That's the first thing. And secondly, could you say something about the sort of social side of it, and perhaps the sort of the reaction to it all? You know, was it what the level of interest and what was going on, that sort of thing?
Well, certainly from faculty point of view, it made it possible for professors, instead of having to have handouts that they gave at the start of classes, at the start of term, they could simply announce, here's the website for the course, and they could add materials to it and edit them as needed.
When did that start happening?
I think that was happening at least by 1995. So we have close to 30 years experience with that. I think it happened really quite quickly. And it does bring up an issue. What if the professor wishes to distribute to the class, say, a chapter from a textbook that's a copyrighted textbook? Well, that really wasn't strictly legal, although I'm sure it happened widely throughout the world. These days, many universities have adopted systems like Blackboard and Canvas, which require a login. And there are mechanisms on campuses to license, say, a chapter of a book for use in a particular class where there's a fee paid according to the number of students. The professors can put the material on that site and know that it's restricted. Now, of course, it doesn't prevent the student from downloading that PDF file and distributing it on a more widely available medium. So it's not a perfect solution, but it does perhaps satisfy some publishers. Nevertheless, I think it's been a very, very healthy development, and I don't think you would find anybody today working in academia who would want to consider a continued existence without internet and the web. It's just really unthinkable today.
So this putting up of things on websites for students, internal websites for students to use, this was relying on laser printers being widely available.
Yes. Yeah, we got our first big laser printer, an Imagen, around 1980, 81 perhaps. It was a $20,000 device, which translated in today's figures means roughly $60,000 to $80,000. In other words, extremely expensive. But when the Apple LaserWriter came out in 1985 and the Hewlett-Packard LaserJet in 1984, the year before, those were devices that were down around $3,000 to $5,000. And of course, we've seen the prices drop into a few $100s now. So today, everybody really has access to a laser printer. There's still many places that charge exorbitant fees. I was down at one of the local commercial copy centers a couple of weeks ago, and they're still charging something like 15 and 20 cents a page for output, and charging several dollars an hour to sit there and use their computers. It's really exorbitant charging, but that's just life in the commercial world. But certainly on campuses, our students have ready access. Our policy in my department has long been that if you're a student here, you deserve to have access to computers and to printers, and we don't pay much attention to sort of normal loads of printing. If someone starts printing out 500 flyers to sell a bicycle, we would notice it and put a stop to it. But otherwise, they're free to print as they please. Many other departments on campus have a charging mechanism where the students have an account and a little ticker goes down each time they print a page, and they have to come up with more money. But my feeling is that that's just wrong. We're an educational institution. Our job is to educate and distribute information. And if we prevent that, we're not doing our jobs.
I remember as a graduate student in the late 70s, the photocopy was the marvelous thing. And I also remember before that on a school trip, actually going to a factory where they made the things. But photocopy was wonderful because you sort of put this one page down and you get 50 or 100 copies of it.
Do you remember this thing with the blue ink where you turn the crank?
Yes, the mimeographs.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Sadly, those existed in my department through the mid-1990s when we finally got rid of the damn things.
I remember the ones that you had these special sheets with the purple ink on them.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, those are the ones.
And there were these special devices where you could use something handwritten and transfer it through the heat onto the Mimeo, and then you could print off 100 copies of them. I do that with my students, and in the late 80s, I would prepare material using tech and print it out on my laser printer or my dot matrix printer, and then take it into the office and produce the mimeographic master of it and then print it off. But now the way to send somebody a physical document is to send the PDF electronically, and then they print off a single copy of it themselves. The whole economics of it has changed. It used to be that moving objects from one particular place to another particular place is expensive, and it is expensive because it has to go from a specific place to another specific place, and that's what the post office does and so forth. Whereas moving it electronically is cheap. And what is the whole economic of print has changed, that it's cheaper to print on demand than to print 100 copies of a book or 500 copies of a book and keep them in a warehouse. And some books, I can't think of a good example to begin with, but something like Shakespeare First Folio would be printed off in 400 copies. You know, have books printed in a few hundred copies or 3,000 copies. I think Jane Austen novels were probably printed off in 500 or 1,000 copies, and then they'd be reprinted. Whereas
I have
now,
a nice example here, which I'll just put up.
Gutenberg.
This is done a number of years ago, but it's full of color. I'll just show a couple of other pages. Essentially, every page spread in this book is different. But the remarkable thing about this book is that the entire book, including the flyleaf, which comes off like this, was printed on a Xerox iGen printing device, which cost about $500,000. But it was a PDF file that went into this machine, and out from the other end came a locally printed single copy of this book, complete with binding and flyleaf in full color. It's really a remarkable technology. And I think if the price can come down enough, then it could become widespread as a means of getting printed copies of books.
Yeah, it's completely changed everything, because previously print was designed to produce many, many identical copies at low price. Whereas now that still exists, but the other function of print is to remove all the distribution problems, because that's electronic media. And you print locally one copy because there's one person that wants it, that just came into the store and said, "Can I have it?"
But another more recent trend is people not printing things at all because they've got gigabytes of memory on the device. They just keep all the PDF files, and you can carry a screen around, which is less weight than carrying lots of printouts. And I know some people who work in media every day professionally don't have a printer at home. It's just a different way of looking at things. And it's I don't print out as much as I used to. If you've got a high resolution, lightweight monitor and enough disk space, then a lot of things you don't have to print anymore.
I've noticed that.
Unfortunately, reached my time limit. I have an off-campus appointment that I have to drive to, so I'm going to have to bail out. But I will see you all
let's
next
not
week.
keep it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nelson.
Okay, until next week.
And I enjoyed your shirt.
Oh, thank you.
And Shams is gone, but I'm very grateful for her contribution from the forum, which is really very helpful and helps put everything into context.